We will now open the Q&A session. I would invite our two speakers to come back. Thank you again. There are some questions that come in. Thank you. I would encourage you to continue submitting your questions if you have, and both questions you like. So firstly, I would like to address one question from Christian. Can you give an example of results based on finance for land-based CDR?
Yeah, so one prime example, I mean, in general, it would be all sorts of payments for ecosystem services that have been used so far. But one prime example, I think, would be reduced emissions from deforestation and degradation, RED+, which also includes reforestation measures, where really the payment is tied to the actual emissions reduction. Of course, coming with their own governance challenges, but in general, payments for ecosystem services have also been shown to be able to be successful, for instance, in the case of reducing deforestation in Costa Rica. But Claire might have more ideas on this.
Sure, yeah. Claire, please share your thoughts.
I mean, it's basically what I was going to say as well. I think Sabine has covered that question well.
Right, okay. So next question, I think is direct to you, Claire. How to manage emission reduction and or CDR so that we avoid crossing tipping points. You mentioned your transition that was separate the emission reduction and carbon removal. Could you please elaborate on that point?
Yeah, so I guess what I was speaking to was that one thing it's really important we can track progress, that we can see what path we're on. And as Sabine said in her presentation, I mean, it's really crucial that we have really fast emissions reductions in the near term. And that's really important for limiting the overshoot of 1.5 degrees and limiting the degree of the climate change impacts that we set ourselves up for. So yeah, I would say that having really clear information on how we're able to reduce our emissions and what we're tracking for, so that we then understand how much carbon removal we will need as well. And you know, if it does look like we're going to overshoot 1.5, then how much carbon removal? How will we scale that up rapidly so that we can kind of keep temperatures as low as possible? But I think, yeah, maybe Sabine also has something to add on that one.
Yeah, maybe just to add, because you were mentioning the pathways I was showing, to just say that these pathways are, of course, the outcome of cost optimization models. And they, of course, take a lot of things for granted. So, and tipping points is typically a thing that's surrounded by a lot of uncertainty. So I think in addition to a cost optimal approach, it might also be warranted to have a little bit of a precautionary approach in the face of these high uncertainties, and that would underline what Claire just said and make an even stronger case to not lose the focus of these short-term drastic emissions reductions.
Thank you both. I would like to move on to the next question. Sabine, you mentioned sustainability factors that need to be monitored while scaling up CDR. Can you say a little more about this and how we might track this, please?
Yes. So one thing I want to stress is that in the systematic literature review that we were doing, and that was also the basis feeding into the IPCC assessment that I was showing, the slide with the side effects on the sustainability dimensions. This rests, of course, on the available literature. So one first thing to do is, of course, to do more research on this, because if a sustainability threat didn't show up, that just means there is little research on it so far. But that doesn't mean that there are no sustainability implications from scaling these things up. So, for instance, for direct air carbon capture and storage, you saw basically a question mark. There was nothing, but that doesn't mean this is the most sustainable technology. It's just because it's a more novel technology. There's less research been going into the side effects. And of course, there could be side effects, right? I mean, this is a technology that needs a lot of energy to get this chemical reaction going, and then this energy has to come from somewhere. It has to be carbon free. If you do it with solar PV, you might even run into conflicts over land use. So that first as a little caveat. Then how would that look in practice? So here I think we can learn a little bit from the experience that we had around bioenergy. For instance, in the European Union, there has been already quite a debate about whether bioenergy is really a good mitigation option, even without CCS, because if you would be dependent on biomass imports, and then this biomass might actually not have been sustainably grown and maybe even have led to further deforestation, then of course we shouldn't be counting that to our emissions reductions. And in response to this whole debate that has been going on around this, they have in the Renewables Directive established sustainability safeguards that sort of try to make sure that certain criteria are fulfilled for the biomass that's being imported. And that, I think, is one example of how you could go into a direction of making these things sustainable. I mean, for different technologies, there will have to be different measures, of course, because not all of them involve biomass. Some of them will have other risks that need to be contained. But I think that also extends into what Claire was saying in her presentation, that yes, we do have some experience in terms of governance mechanisms when it comes to land management and therefore the land-based CDR approaches. But I think we also need to develop an understanding of possible sustainability risks of the others and how they could actually be sustained. And then, of course, you have sustainability risks that have to do with CDR in general, right? This is also what Claire was touching briefly upon in her talk. We have to have governance measures in place that sort of prevent governments from not reducing emissions in the short run and sort of buying uncertain amounts of CO2 fallback options in the long run. So that's what I would say about that.
Thank you, Sabine. Next question, I would like ask Claire to address. What can we learn from REDD+ for other non-land-based CDR technologies?
I think that's a really interesting question, and I'm sure that there is a lot that we could learn from REDD+. I think things like the governance challenges that a lot of countries that have been implementing REDD+ face. A lot of those will apply also if we want to use, for example, bioenergy with CCS, with bioenergy feedstocks grown in those countries, then making sure that countries have the right enabling conditions for them to be able to monitor it effectively, to put adequate safeguards in place effectively. And I think the fact that the REDD+ initiative has been running for quite a long time now, and we do have a lot of lessons that we can look at, what worked and what didn't work. And I guess it would be most relevant for the land-based carbon removal options. Thinking off the top of my head, I don't know how it might apply to other options, but I think basically a very interesting question. But maybe Sabine also has some thoughts on that.
I think you answered that perfectly. Thanks.
Okay, next question to you both. But I would like to ask Sabine to share her thoughts. Firstly, how could we trigger a process to start addressing one key question: who should pay and how much for CDR? Sabine?
Yes, I'll try to be short on that because Claire has just published an excellent paper on how we should share the CDR burden based on the different principles extending from equity to other elements of justice. But in principle, just from an economic point of view, if we agree that we want to reach 1.5 degree and one necessary requirement for that is net zero in 2050, then I think in principle, this would mean that by the middle of the century, every ton of CO2 that's still being emitted should actually pay for its own removal, right? So in principle, if you had a CO2 price, be it a tax, be it emissions trading, then any residual positive emissions would be at a price where you could also remove them for. So that would sort of address the question of how could the financing of a net zero target look like. I admit that it becomes a little bit more difficult when you want to go net negative, as most of the pathways do, because then you're sort of asking someone to provide a public good, carbon removal, and you don't have the proceeds from taxing residual emissions anymore. But if that is if that is a pathway that we choose, then we will have to find other resources to finance this. But yeah, I'll let Claire say something about who should pay what.
I realize I'm not necessary. It's just that goes very smoothly. Please share with us what, based on your recent publication.
Yeah, thanks for the plug, guys. So I mean, this is sort of a question that motivated some research that I recently did with some other colleagues, which looked at how would equity considerations affect the question of responsibility for carbon removal, and we did this because a lot of people have talked about responsibility for emissions reductions. That's been a hot topic for quite a long time, but we thought maybe we should start talking about who is responsible for carbon removal. And we don't have answers per se. I mean, we just looked at different ways that you could consider responsibility. And another recent paper by Pozzo and colleagues also considered different framings of responsibility. So you could think about like who is culpable for climate change, who has emitted the most over the last century or so, or over the last few decades. Perhaps they should do more. Or you could think about who has more money available, who has a higher GDP, who has perhaps more income available that they could actually afford to pay the CDR. So yeah, we looked at those two cases, and I think that the main point that we wanted to get across is that when you look at the results from an integrated assessment model, this is really looking at a least cost distribution. So they will allocate carbon removal to different countries according to where it's cheapest to do it. But that's obviously an assumption that you're making, that you want to do it in the places that it's cheapest, without necessarily thinking about actually who is responsible for doing it. So yeah, I would feel free to check out our paper. But I think it's a really important question, and I think as Sabine was saying, like the next question after that would be then kind of what instruments would you use to make sure that there is money there. But yeah, we hope that sort of triggering this conversation about responsibility is a good first step. But I don't know about a process after that. That's a good question.
Thank you, Claire. Looking forward to more research and insights on this important issue soon. So next question is also directed to Claire. You mentioned the need for improved inventory data. Can you say more about what are the most immediate steps that can be taken to start this process? Where can these steps be taken in the next 5 years?
Yeah, so I think the biggest hurdle here would be supporting developing countries that have less experience of providing inventory data of their emissions removals, or they just face capacity constraints. So yeah, I think that's going to be the big challenge over the next 5 years. I mean, if you look under the UNFCCC, there's actually only a very small number of countries who have experience of reporting every year their greenhouse gas inventories, and that's only the I guess like a lot of the developed countries who have been doing that, whereas there's a whole load of countries who haven't got that experience, and they maybe can't report emissions from every sector, or they don't understand what all of the gases are doing. And so I think that's going to be really important to make sure that they get we can ensure some means of capacity building and technology transfer. And improved technology in particular can help here, I think, to make sure that these inventory data gaps can be filled and uncertainties can be reduced, especially with regards to the land sector, where we know that uncertainties are particularly high. Even for developed countries, there are big uncertainties and challenges, and including in, for example, differentiating between what would be considered an anthropogenic removal or emission and a non-anthropogenic removal or emission. And there's some sort of grey area in between. And at the moment, countries use a kind of a proxy for determining that, but that itself is imperfect. So I think, those are going to be the areas in the next, well, maybe we can solve it in 5 years, maybe we'll need longer, we'll see.
Right. Thank you, Claire. This question is, I think, directed to you both. I will first start with Sabine. Can you say more about the potential deliberation processes for choosing the CDR pathways, and what could these processes look like?
Yes, so the reason why I was saying this is that there's been a lot of research and a lot of assessment of, what are the kind of approaches that we have at hand to remove CO2, what would be the potential, what would they cost, where would they work, and so on. And in one sense, this is good, of course, because we know what we have at hand. We sort of have our toolbox, but experience shows that if you don't have a deliberative process accompanying these kind of things, and we've seen this, for instance, here in Germany with carbon capture and storage, then you can have a good technology at hand, but nobody wants it actually to be around. So that's why I think it's not enough to just get the technologies right, the knowledge on this right, and sort of even to get the governance mechanisms right. But it's important to have a dialogue around what we want to do and how we want to do it. Only in that case we can actually go through like the full innovation chain that is not only supply side but also demand side. Now, another aspect of this is also not how we want to do it, but how much of it we actually want to do. Because as I showed, there's different pathways, and you could have more CDR in a medium to long run, allowing a little bit more easing in the short run. And especially these days, I mean, we've just experienced a lockdown, economic recession. We have discussions about recovery packages, but first estimates show that we'll end up at something around 5 to 7% emissions reductions for 2020, which is what we would need to get to zero. But do we want to I mean, can we do this another 10 years? Probably the answer is no. So we'll have to sort of explore how much we can do, and this is also something that you see at UNFCCC level, right? So I showed these pathways before, and a lot of delegations in Korea said a pathway where we overshoot a lot during the middle of the century, and we have much higher temperatures than 2 degrees C, then come back through removal to 1.5 degrees warming in the end of the century. That's not a valid 1.5 degree pathway for us. And because we still have to live with the impacts, there's uncertainty whether some of this can even be reversed and so on. And so this is exactly what I mean with the deliberation process, right? I mean, in this case, we made those gray, so it might not seem like a big achievement, but it already frames the debate of the options that are on the table, and that society will be ready to live and accept and implement.
Thank you, Sabine. We should keep in mind that the technical challenges is the small part of the whole story, and societal choices are much more, I think, challenging. Claire, do you have any thoughts on this question? No,
I think Sabine made some really good points there. I think, as she said, the public public awareness and public acceptability will be really important, and full stakeholder engagement when developing strategies at the national level and at the local level. I think one thing we've seen a lot recently is a lot of companies coming forward with net zero targets, where they're going to, planning on planting forests or, using offsets to achieve net zero. And I think we really need to have a bit more, to be able to trust these companies more in what they're doing, and maybe more transparency in how they're planning to achieve these goals. If they're going to use carbon removal, how they're going to make sure they're not just kind of taking the lowest hanging fruit of planting some trees somewhere where it's quite easy to plant trees, and whether they're actually thinking out into the long term about what really a 1.5 pathway means, looking out over several decades, and that there are harder options that we're going to have to look at and develop and scale up as well. But yeah, I think for all of that, an open discussion and much more public awareness, and in particular awareness that carbon removal cannot be used as a means to avoid reducing emissions. And I think that's a real sticking point at the moment, this kind of greenwashing concern. So yeah, I think that's one of our key challenges.
Thank you. Thank you, Claire, for this final point. I think we're close to the end of this session. I think we haven't be able to address all the questions, but thank you to your participation, to Sabine, Claire, and to our participants for your time, for such a stimulating discussion. And a few messages to our participants. You can find further resources on this topic and other topics on our website, including compare chat on the same topic with a broader group of experts. You can find that on our website. Also, please complete the post-event survey for evaluation purpose, but also can help us to improve our future events. So we look forward to you joining us for future events. If you're interested and want to go deeper on CDR issues, please sign up for the upcoming event on Friday, which is moderated by my colleague Nick Harrison. I think Claire and you and your colleague will join us at that event. So lastly, I would like to thank my two colleagues who are behind the screen, Anita and Michael Thompson, who have provided technical and substantive support. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.